Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and this is episode 73 in the series. This one is called New Zealand and Norland, because we're going to talk all about New Zealand wool and New Zealand yarn, and we're going to talk about Norland, which is this beautiful guy over here. I also have a Shop My Stash sale to announce, a huge giveaway from Maniototo Wool. So I'm coming to you from Urbana, Illinois, and I'm a professor at the university there, and I teach science fiction, science studies, science stuff of all kinds. And yes, I'm in an English department, which is really fun. And this is a podcast about knitting, garment modification, DIY, kind of like design work, a little bit of spinning every once in a while. I haven't done that as much lately, but I'm hoping to get back into it. Our guild is the Champaign-Urbana Spinners and Weavers Guild, is going to host a team. We're going to go to Greencastle, Indiana in April, and we're going to do a sheep to shawl demonstration there, and then that's a lot of spinning and weaving. And then we're hoping to go up to Wisconsin for the sheep to shawl competition up there as well. So my group has been doing this. This will be our third year doing it, and it should be fun. It's the time of year when I really spin the most, and I enjoy it quite a bit. So I usually tell you what I'm wearing, but I'm not wearing any woolies because it is 60 degrees and sunny outside. I'm looking out the window. I can see the dogs running by. Spencer's moving like wood and branches around. We pruned our apple trees. I think I mentioned that in the last episode. So the weather is improving here. Things are getting warmer, and I'm not in my woolly sweaters. I'm actually in short sleeves, if you can believe it, because it's 60 degrees outside. Kind of crazy. Okay. Introductions aside, I'm very happy to be here with you guys today, and I'd like to welcome all of you, especially those of you who are coming back. Welcome back, and those of you who are new, I hope you find something that you like here. You can find all the show notes for anything I talk about on the cast today over on the blog, which is knittingthestash.wordpress.com, which I'll put down here like I usually do. And if you're looking for me, you can find me just about everywhere as Knitting the Stash, on Instagram, here on YouTube, on Ravelry, and I love to hear from you guys. So get in touch. Let me know what's going on with you, what you're making, what you're doing, and I will do my best to get back to you as soon as possible. So I think we'll jump right in with some stash diving, some stash cleaning, right? It's springtime. I've been washing my sweaters. I've been going through the yarn room, making sure everything is cleaned up and neat and tidy. The other thing that I've been doing is kind of going through my stash and trying to look for things that have been in there for maybe a year or more and that I'm not using. Obviously, I think they're beautiful things because I picked them up and acquired them originally, but I'm not using them, and I kind of am of the mind that if I'm not using it, someone else should be. So I put up a Shop My Stash sale over on Ravelry. If you find your way to my Ravelry page, under the stash option, there's a whole bunch of stuff in the trade or sell window that they have that I put up for sale there. So if you're interested in shopping my stash and seeing what I had in there and seeing if it's something you'd want to add to your stash, check it out and get in touch with me. Let me know. There's both fiber over there and yarn. A lot of indie dyers, some really cool folks who I've met along the way and purchased things from, and then haven't had a chance to knit with because I've been doing so many sweaters and test knits and whatnot. So I feel like these things should go to a good home, and that's where you guys come in. So if you want to shop my stash, head on over to Ravelry. And it's been really great to clean out the yarn room because the yarn room always needs to be cleaned and refreshed and organized, and it makes me happy, basically. So let's turn now to finished object. And I want to talk about not only the design, but I want to talk about the yarn that I used for this. So this is Norland, and it's by Sarah Huntington Birch. And Sarah Huntington Birch is Dinosaura, I always say Dinosaura, I think it's Dinasara, knits on Ravelry and Instagram. And she's someone I've followed around for a long time because her designs are really amazing. She does a lot of this kind of color work mixed with cables, or like projects where a gradient in the background makes a huge difference in the design in the foreground. I really have long admired her work, but I often felt it was too complicated for me as a knitter because it involved color work and cables and, like combinations of techniques that I was like, I really wasn't a very good color work knitter until about a year and a half ago. So it was a little bit out of my league, I felt like. But I do think her patterns are absolutely accessible. She does have more accessible patterns. These were just the ones that I wanted to knit. And it took me a while to get up the gumption and the skill to be able to do it. But I was researching her and kind of checking out the rest of her work, and I found out she's actually a paleontologist. She's an assistant professor out in New York, and she's an assistant professor of biology, and that partially explains why a lot of her inspiration comes from nature, and she has a lot of birds and trees and beautiful things that are represented in her designs. So Sarah, from one professor to another, I dig it. It's cool. I love your work. So I knit the Norland. This is the Norland cowl, which doesn't actually exist anywhere. You can get a Norland hat and a Norland mitten, but not a Norland cowl until now. This is my modification. This is what I'm here for, guys. So I knit this up in some beautiful wool from New Zealand. And this is the Maniototo wool that I used for this. This is New Zealand wool by Furness Weir, and it is some beautiful yarn. These are both fingering weight yarn. One is a rough ridge, the rough ridge line of yarns, and the other is a 4-ply sock. And I've got my handy dandy cable needle in there. If anybody's interested in like what I use to cable with, I use this cable needle. It has these little grooves on it, and that holds your yarn. If you're holding it in the front or the back, it kind of holds your yarn, so you're not having to use the cable hooks, which I find slip and pop and fly all over, and they're just extra. This is like having a miniature double-pointed needle that has a little grip to it that you can just hold in the back, hold in the front, and it's, oh, I love it. And then I stick it in my hair, and I leave it there, and I forget about it, and then I wander around the house and lose it, or drop it in the food, or, you know, like stab somebody in the eye when I go to give them a hug. So that's the only thing you have to really be careful of. But otherwise, this is my tool of choice. So this yarn came to me from Furness Weir, who is a wonderful yarn producer out of New Zealand. And let me show you her tag. This is for the 4-ply sock, and I love her logo. I think it's just the best. And this is the dark color is night sky, which makes perfect sense for this cowl, and the light color is the natural undyed of her rough ridge line of yarn. The rough ridge wool is really cool because all of her yarn is hand dyed, and the rough ridge in particular takes up the colors in different kinds of ways, so each skein is really unique. This is in her flax colorway, and you can see there's some really beautiful variation. And that's partially, I think, because she's overdying this gorgeous blend, which is both a white wool, which I'll talk about in a little while, and a kind of colored Polwarth wool. So it's a blend of 85 merino and 15 Polwarth. So that's how she gets this heathered color. And then she overdyes this heathered color, and that's what produces partially this really neat variegation in the rough ridge version of the yarn. And this is a woolen spun yarn, and so that's what this light color is. And then the darker night sky background color, which is the sock, is actually a worsted spun yarn. So I put together the worsted and the woolen for this cowl, and I think that it produced a really nice result because the background is kind of a little bit smoother, and then the trees, which are in the foreground, have a really beautiful kind of textured quality to them, I think. I think you can see that there. And you can also see the variation in the natural, which moves from a gray to a white to a gray, depending on how much you're using for the whatever you're knitting up, right? And the design obviously goes all the way around. So I absolutely loved working with this wool. This is like the softest cowl I think I've ever like experienced. It's like, because it's the lighter color is that woolen spun, it has that lightness to it. So this is the perfect setup for me for a cowl, because when I go out and walk the dogs, I need to have right up over my nose, underneath my coat, and I have this beautiful kind of seam that runs all the way around the cowl. And you can also, the wool is soft enough that you could just push it down and it would be fine just that way. Okay, bad hair moment. Yeah. Okay, so this pattern is a Colorwork cable pattern, and I posted this on Instagram, and you guys were so sweet. You were so kind about your comments. And my Colorwork is not perfect, my cables are not perfect, but when you put them together, they came out pretty well, I think. And this is what the inside looks like. So you are doing color work all the way around as you're cabling. So you do have these floats that you're carrying and floats that you're catching. And I caught them every 4 or 5 stitches so that they wouldn't be too long. And I mean, that's so, I love the inside of knitting. I love seeing like how neat you could be on the inside. It's just one of those things for me. It's like a good armpit. I've talked to you guys about that before. Okay, so let me hang this back up here so that I can talk about it while not holding it at the same time. So this pattern was intended to be a hat and a set of mittens. And I cast on as if for the hat, but with needles that were 2 sizes up. I think that's what I did. At least 1 size, maybe 2. You can check my Ravelry page to find out. And then I was working all the way up, and I wanted this to be a cowl because although the hat and the mittens are absolutely lovely, gorgeous, beautiful pattern, I just thought, you know, I kind of want to be able to see the scene. And the hat, the thing about the hat is that it gathers together the trees at the top. So the hat would almost do kind of like this to the trees, and then it had, yeah, just like that. And then the decreases happen in a beautiful way around the crown at the top of the hat. But I wanted to kind of lay out the whole scene so that it would be visible, and I just kind of like the idea of modifying things, which you guys know is my favorite thing to do with all knitting patterns. So I wanted to modify this one into a cowl, and the way that I did that is once I got up to where the decreases should have started, I just didn't do the decreases, but I added into this open space that was going to be created some more of the snowflakes from down below. Fewer of them, but something to offset the kind of color there. And I've got my charts here because I wanted to show you, I'm not going to show you the whole chart for the pattern because that's Sarah Birch's pattern, but I do want to show you just the very top of it where I started filling in the empty space with my own version of some of the little snowflakes. And I basically just set up a grid, like a graph paper style grid, and filled in with white or blue what I wanted the actual design to look like. And that's how I ended up with this kind of like the blue background with the white snowflake foreground. And by the way, I don't know if you guys do this, but it's something that came to my attention way back when I first started cabling, is that when you have charts, the best thing you can do for yourself is to color code them. So I always go through my knitting charts and the key, and I will color code the different ways that the cables are crossing. So on my chart, I have them color coded like this so that I know which one, you know, if it's going one way or another, it'll remind myself that it's like a left-leaning or a right-leaning cross. And again, like on the pattern itself, I will then go in and color code the cables. And that way, when I can look at the chart, I can kind of visually discern very quickly if it's a right or a left leaning, because it's kind of easy to miss if you're just looking at the chart and you're kind of trying to follow along with things. So I color code my charts, and I highly recommend that to anyone who's dealing with charts. And maybe that's just really well-known, widespread knowledge in the knitting world, but especially for those of you who are new to knitting cables, it's one of those things that just makes your life easier, so go for it. Okay, so the other thing about this pattern is that because you're working the color work, you got to make sure, like I showed you, that your tension is nice and even all along. But you're also looking at the chart to figure out where you're crossing your cables and where you're moving your colors, right? And one thing that Sarah Birch talks about in her pattern is the fact that the easiest way to know, you know, all of the cable crosses in the symbols look like they're in this case, in this contrast color, in like a white, plain white, with the black background. So I showed you that here a little bit, right? All of the crosses are just in white, which could give you the false impression that all the cables are always white on white when you're crossing them, but that's not true. So if you are trying to get started on working on a Colorwork cable pattern, the best advice I thought from her pattern was that you just look a row ahead on the chart. So I always keep my paper, like, or my marker, my ruler, whatever it is here, so that I can see what row I'm on and I can see everything below it. But when you're working this kind of pattern, it's also important to see just what's above those cable crosses, because that's going to determine what colors you need to work first and second. Oftentimes, you kind of deal with the color as you meet it. So if you are holding a couple in the back and the color that presents itself is your main color, then you're very likely going to knit your main color. And if you're holding it if you're holding back some of your main color in the, one direction or the other, and you're presented with a contrast color, very often you're going to be knitting that contrast color. But just to check yourself, you just look ahead, one line up on your chart, and then you can tell which color should be first and which color should be second, because those colors are often changing exactly at the cross to produce this kind of effect of, it looks like movement across the thing, and it is movement, but you need to be able to then replace those stitches that you're moving over with the other stitches, right, of the other color. So I was like, what? That's so cool. I totally get it now. So thank you, Sarah, for teaching me something new about knitting with your pattern. I really appreciated it. So this pattern, as I said, it's a hat and a set of mittens, which are gorgeous. And I actually have, this was half a skein of the natural Ruffridge this fingering weight, and this was a full skein of the Night Sky. And I actually have enough of this left over to still go and knit the hat. So I think that's what I'm going to do, because I really want to have a matching set, like a cowl and a hat with this pattern on it. So I think I'll do that. But it didn't really take all that much of the contrast color to be able to do this work, even though I used the contrast color for the ribbing on the bottom and the top. So for what it's worth. And the other thing about this that I'd mention is that if you're interested in modifying this pattern and making this into a cowl for you, maybe you started on the hat and it was too big, or maybe you just want to go for the cowl. I put instructions in my Ravelry project page for this that would help you figure out what to do with this upper part of the pattern. Now, those instructions depend on you having purchased the pattern from Sarah. So the instructions are not independent. You can't just go to my Ravelry page and learn how to do this. You need Sarah's pattern. And then from Sarah's pattern, I've given you some of the basic ideas or instructions for how to mod the very upper rows of this pattern to make it come out like a cowl. So that's my experience with Sarah Birch's beautiful pattern, and I am ready to go take on some of her shawls and her other hats and to do so much more with this colorwork and cable thing, because I think it just produces some of the best, most beautiful fabric I've ever seen. And this is pretty much when I started knitting. I remember finding patterns like this and just not even having any kind of comprehension of how they were done, how one could do both colorwork and cables and make things move. It looks almost like the yarn is moving across the background, and it is, but it's actually very doable. So for me, this is kind of like a life list moment to have done something like this and to understand it and to be ready to go on to do some other patterns. So I hope that some of you will take on the challenge and let me know how you're doing with it. I'd love to know what your kind of life list things are, and maybe we can start a little Ravelry thread about that. What are some of the patterns that you just dreamed of knitting or believed were out of your reach, and then are you trying to tackle them, or are you at a place where you're trying to learn the skills to be able to work up to it, or where are you? I'd love to know, because for me this was pretty much this is tops. Knitting sweaters, that was also tops, and then this is something I've dreamed about for a very long time, so I'm pretty darn excited that this came together, and that it came together with Maniototo Wool, which I want to talk about now. Some New Zealand sheep and New Zealand wool kind of bits and bobs here. So as some of you know, I've been in conversation with Furness Weir, who is the brilliant mind behind Maniototo Wool, and she and I started chatting because I went on her website and I found the most gorgeous yarn, and I thought to myself, oh my god, this is amazing yarn, and I started to learn the story behind it, which is that Mary is basically working to keep some of New Zealand's wool in New Zealand. It turns out that yes, New Zealand is a massive wool producer, though they've been on the decline since the 80s for a bunch of different reasons. So New Zealand is a massive wool producer, but a lot of that wool is exported, shipped out, and the farmers who raise the sheep don't often see the products of their labor. Like they don't see the yarn being marketed and sold in New Zealand as New Zealand wool, because it goes off to the world of like companies like Smart Wool and things like that will buy massive kilos of their wool. So Mary's been working with local farmers to buy some of their fleece for the year, some of the best fleece that's from their flock. And then she's been having it scoured close to her home. She's been having it milled within a couple hours of her home. And then milled and spun. And then she's doing all the dyeing for her own yarn lines. And then other indie dyers in New Zealand are buying her yarn and they're dyeing it for their own, industry. So she's really producing a kind of mini fiber shed in New Zealand. And I know that she might not talk about it in quite those terms, but I think for us, especially those of you who are watching in the US, we've been talking a little bit about fiber sheds on here, and you might have seen the new book that came out called Fiber Shed, and some of the talk of like, how do we keep wool and yarn more local? How do we recognize the supply chains from farmer and sheep to finished skein of yarn? So to my mind, what Mary's doing is she's like preserving a certain kind of New Zealand wool within New Zealand. She's in the Maniototo region, which is why the wool is called Maniototo. And I'm going to put a little map up here somewhere so that you can see where she is in New Zealand. Basically, she's on the kind of closer to the southern tip of New Zealand. And New Zealand is a really interesting place because I've been doing a little research after talking to Mary, and you can read more about her process over on the blog in the interview. But I've been doing a little more research about New Zealand, and it really is a very varied terrain. So mountains, oceans, parts of it are very dry, like the area that she's in is a fairly dry area, whereas there's a lot of portions of New Zealand that are very wet. And so when you're thinking about all that variation in terrain and weather and things like that, different sheep breeds are going to thrive in different kinds of conditions. So where she is, she happens to be near a farmer who is able to raise some merino sheep, but merino sheep aren't really the biggest herds of sheep in New Zealand. And I did a little bit of research just to find out, and this was from the Teara Encyclopedia of New Zealand. It's a government site where they give some information on New Zealand sheep breeds. So the bigger sheep breeds in New Zealand, some of them do have merino kind of crossed back, like within the breed. But merino sheep, because it's so wet, they're not really well suited. They get a lot of foot rot, and so do some other breeds. So there are certain breeds that are actually better suited than others to the conditions in other parts of New Zealand. So in New Zealand, there's about 2.8 million Corriedale sheep, and that's a sheep that a lot of us might be familiar with. It's like a medium kind of fleece sheep. It can be used for meat or for fleece. A medium kind of wool. It's not as fine as merino, but it's not a like coarser long wool. So it's a nice kind of medium sheep. There's a half-bred, which is merino, where the merino influence is maintained. So the merino genes are bred back into the sheep over and over again. Whereas with the Corriedale, it was a cross between a merino and a long wool, and then the Corriedales that were produced were interbred with themselves. So it was like Corriedale with Corriedale with Corriedale with Corriedale. Whereas the half-bred sheep, there's the initial cross that produces a half-bred sheep, and then the next time that they breed the sheep, they bring the merino back in, so that it's like constantly bringing the merino back into the line. And Mary sent me actually some raw and washed fleece from one of these half-bred sheep. So this is the raw fleece, which is really beautiful, and it has a fine crimp to it. I've been like, it smells good. It smells very sheepy. So this is the raw version, and you can see it's a fairly long staple length. It has like a nice crimp to it. And then this is some of the washed wool. I'm trying to go butt to tip here so that you can see. This is what it looks like washed, scoured, very white, right? You can see the difference between the two of them. This is what wool looks like when it's been washed. And this is from that half-bred sheep, where the merino bloodline is constantly refreshed in there. So half-bred sheep make up about 1.8 million head in New Zealand. And then there are the Romney sheep, which are really resistant to rain and foot rot. So they make up 68% of the national flock in New Zealand. Somewhere around 25 million sheep are Romney, and they're just really well suited to the rest of the terrain in the rest of New Zealand. There's also Drysdale, which is developed from a kind of hairier Romney. So Romney sheep, apparently, some of them are just have these, like their fleece is very hairy, and someone decided to take that quality and breed the Drysdale sheep. And then there are Perrendales, which is a cross between Cheviot and Romneys, and they're really good for the hillsides in New Zealand, apparently. And there are about 3 or 4 million of those. And then Coopworth, which is a Romney and a Border Leicester, and there are about 7 million of those, and those are good for the wetter lowlands because of the Romney in there. They're resistant to rain and foot rot, right? So New Zealand has like, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like 6 main breeds, it looks like, and I'm sure there are smaller farms that are raising, more heritage breeds and things like this. But if we're looking at the massive scale of wool production in New Zealand, those are some of the big breeds there. And it's interesting that Mary's working with the wool that's kind of local to her is actually from a drier portion of the region. So it's actually merino mixed with Polwarth. And she gets the merino, which is all white, and then she gets the Polwarth, which is a colored Polwarth, and she blends those two together. And that's, as I said, how she gets this beautiful heathered kind of gray natural color that she then overdyes. So that, I was really kind of like taken by learning a little bit more about the breeds that are in New Zealand and the kind of like terrain and the requirements of like why certain sheep would do better in certain areas, certain breeds would do better in certain areas. So that was kind of pretty interesting. So Mary has a lineup of I think 8 different yarns, all the way from like an Aran weight down to some fingering weight yarn. And as I said, she dyes them herself. And they're really, really beautiful. So I'm just going to show you a few of them. I'm going to duck down because I have them all down here on the ground here. So she has a luxury lamb's wool, and this is in the denim colorway. And this is a beautiful, like a DK weight yarn. And you can see it's like super squishy and really, really pretty. I love that one. I think it's just, and look at the sheep. There's sheep. She also has, as I showed you, that Rough Ridge yarn. So the Rough Ridge that I showed you was the flax color, which is this beautiful. This is a fingering weight version of the Rough Ridge. And that is the merino crossed with the colored Polwarth. And she also has a DK version of that. This is for the giveaway. There are a couple here for the giveaway, which are going to be really fun. So this is Duck Pond, and this is the natural, and these are the DK weight. And you can see the beautiful variation in there. I just love that. It's so pretty. So this is, again, 80% merino, 20% Polwarth cross. And she has some beautiful fingering weight sock yarn. So I showed you the solid color. This was Night Sky, which is I knit up in this cowl. But she also has some beautiful 4-ply sock that is speckly, where she overdyed the original dye with these beautiful speckled. This is speckled sage, which I think is quite pretty. And this is 85% merino with crossed with 15% nylon. All of Mary's yarns are not superwash. They're all just straight up natural fibers. And there are a couple reasons for that. One is that there's not a superwash processing plant in New Zealand, and she wants to keep all of her process like under her control. So she knows the scouring folks, and she knows the mill, and she has a handle on like watching her wool go through the process. Whereas if she wanted to superwash it, she'd have to send it off to some other country to get it superwashed. So that's one reason. The other reason is that she just likes the natural fibers, and I can't blame her because you guys know how I feel about natural fibers. I think they're really awesome, resilient. There are lots of good qualities to wool that you can't get if you're using superwash. That's not to say that superwash doesn't have a place, as I've always said. It's just that there's some really great qualities to natural fibers that I absolutely love. So I appreciate that Mary is not using superwash. She's just going for the straight natural fibers. So along with the merino Colorwork crosses that she has for her yarn, she also did a special, I think it was a one time only, Save the Trees yarn, which is, this is the lace bark colorway of that. And this is a blend of, it's a DK yarn, and it's a blend of 75% merino, 15% possum, and 10% Colorwork. Now, I've talked on here before, and I'll put the episode in the show notes, about possum yarn from New Zealand. And in New Zealand, possums are an invasive species. And so there are government management programs that are culling the possums, which means killing them. And rather than waste the fur, there's an industry has kind of popped up around the possum fur so that it's actually being used, because this yarn is really gorgeous. Possum, as many of you might know, is incredibly soft, and soft and really warm. So there's a reason that it's only 15% blended in here, because actually any more and it might be too warm to wear, because possum is so warm. It also gives a kind of a little bit of a fuzziness to the yarn that I'm not sure the camera can pick up on, but in person you can kind of see that. And Mary talked a little bit about the process of producing this and why it's a one-off yarn over in the interview. But basically it's the process of washing the possum fiber was really labor intensive, and she did it once and she won't do it again. So this is a beautiful skein of her Save the Trees yarn, and she has dyed this up on her website. You can see a bunch of different colors for that one. So like I said, she's got 8 different yarns. 3 of them are worsted spun. So like this Night Sky that I used for the cowl is a worsted spun yarn, which means all the fibers are aligned and going in the same direction. There's less air in it, and it's a smooth, kind of dense yarn. Whereas the other 5 yarns that she has are woolen spun, and woolen spun yarn has more air in it. It's carded, so the fibers are going in all kinds of different directions, which traps the air, and it's very, very light. I mean, it's like this should weigh more than it does for the amount of yarn that's here, but it just doesn't, because it's such a light woolen spun yarn. So Mary's yarn I found to be like incredibly pretty. We actually did a swap. So I sent her some shorn, some of my farm to skein yarn, and she sent me some rough ridge of her farm to skein yarn. So I will hopefully have a sweater that I can knit up in Maniototo Wool very shortly. But she also sent along with our sweater swap, she sent along some yarn for a giveaway. So you guys can try New Zealand yarn if you want to get in on this giveaway. And what we're giving away here, what Mary's giving away, I've got, we're gonna do, let's do 2 winners, okay? So the first prize will be 2 skeins of this beautiful DK luxury lamb's wool in denim. Beautiful, lovely. And this is one of the worsted spun applications of this yarn. And the other giveaway will be for 2 skeins of her Rough Ridge DK, which would make a beautiful colorwork project. And one's in Duck Pond and one's in Natural. So we've got 2 beautiful giveaways for you guys. And what I'd ask you to do to be entered to win both of these, like so that you win either prize, is leave a comment below in this YouTube episode or over on the Ravelry group. I'll open up a thread there. Or over on the blog, those 3 places as usual. And just tell me and Mary what your favorite yarn of hers is. Like, check out her website. I'll put a link up on the show notes. Let us know your favorite yarn, your favorite colorway, what you see over there that you like. That would be great. And I will put you in the running to win one of these 2 awesome prizes. And as usual, domestic shipping anywhere in the US, I will totally cover. If you're an international winner, I would ask that you cover your own postage on this one. So I'm happy to open this giveaway to everyone in the world who's interested in farm to fiber and farm to skein yarns and interested in New Zealand wool. So Thanks so much to Mary for the wonderful chat that we've had, the exchange, the opportunity to try out some of your beautiful New Zealand wool, and to spread the word about Maniototo wool to the rest of the world. So thank you, Mary. Truly enjoyed this fun exchange and learning more about New Zealand and New Zealand wool culture. And if you're interested, check out the blog and the interview. Mary just had so much experience and information to share over there. It was just really wonderful talking to her. We have a nice community over on Ravelry. There's a nice kind of chat group over there, discussion group, and you can join in on any of the things that are going on anytime. We have a cowl over there for knits and translation, and we have a cowl going on for disc stitch. And I mention that because Asia Brill, who wrote the disc stitch book, has just put out a new pattern, and I'll put it up on the screen here somewhere, for a brioche scarf that has a disc stitch selvage. So she's been kind of over in the Ravelry group, kind of hanging out for this cowl, and wanted you guys to know that she is offering that pattern. Is free on Ravelry right now. I will put a link to it in the show notes, which are always over on the blog. And you can work on that brioche little scarf with the selvage that's using disc stitch if you want to. And if you do, we'll enter you, it'll be an extra entry into our cowl where there are some prizes and fun stuff like that. So if you're interested in getting into the disc stitch cowl, jump on over there. Our other cowl, our Knits and Translation cowl, we had a winner for the mid-cowl draw, and that was Anita of Yarn and Vegetables, and Anita is winning this beautiful project bag from the Cocoon Tree, which is Lorna Lancaster. She sponsored a huge giveaway, maybe, 5 or 6 episodes ago? Beautiful bag maker out of the UK, and these bags are just super well made, beautiful, lined, all kinds of different shapes and sizes and fabrics. So thank you, Lorna, for the bags. And this one is going off to Anita of Yarn and Vegetables for the Knits and Translation cowl. So congratulations, Anita. So I think that might be it for today. Let me check my notes. Yeah, and I know I promised an update on the Afterthought sweater and the chimney sweater. They're coming along, but I'm gonna wait until next cast to talk about those guys. This was just, the life list was just enough for today. So I hope you all have fun out there in Knitting Land, and I will see you in a couple of weeks. And be in touch, join the giveaway, join the cows, have some fun, and I'll see you in a couple weeks. All right, bye-bye.